Hi, and welcome to NAB's Merchant Fraud webinar. My name is Amber Marotra, and I'm a State Director in our Corporate Transactional Banking team. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So today we're going to be launching our first webinar in NAB's Client Insight series, bringing you bite-sized market thematics, solutions, hints, and tips for our corporate clients. Fraud doesn't discriminate, and whether you're kind of a small business or a large business, and now more than ever, it's definitely a boardroom agenda. So today's session, we're going to bring merchant fraud to life. So bring you some statistics, some common scams, and what we're seeing actually in this space. So what you can expect from today. So we'll talk to you around how to mitigate merchant risk as a whole, and actually what the process of chargebacks is. So as the session's only 30 minutes today, we're going to be responding back to you via the Q&A. So feel free to jump in and ask your questions at any time. I'm joined today by my colleagues and presenters. So Jared Grant, who's also a State Director in our Corporate Transactional Banking team based in Queensland, Anthony Carr and Billy Cialtis, who are actually going to be answering your questions throughout the session from our Merchant Security Services. So I'll hand across to Jared for the presentation.
Thanks very much, Amber, and appreciate the introduction. So as mentioned, my name is Jared Grant. So I'm based up in Queensland and State Director looking after corporate and institutional clients here. Well, this is a great forum that we're putting in place, and look, we're looking to continue through the year to basically share with you some of the insights that come across our desks. Obviously, having a large portfolio of clients, we hear some of the themes and some of the trends and some of those powerful conversations that you know, if we take away the client's name, resonate with a lot of businesses, including yourselves. So hopefully through sharing some of these insights and sharing some of these scenarios, we enable you to make better business decisions based on that information. So I apologize firstly, I have two screens, so you might see me looking off to the side. I'm trying to look at the larger of the two, and the larger of the two doesn't have the camera. So bear with me as you might see the side of my face for the majority of it. I'll ask you to move on to the next slide, please, Amber. Okay, so I want to start with a little bit of the overview of some of the statistics around payment fraud, and this is specific to the Australian domestic market. The statistics are based on a calendar year. So we had last year's January to December 2020, and we're really looking forward to the statistics that'll come out for the 2021 year. Obviously, what's really interesting here is the shift in the market. So, you know, COVID's really impacted traditional bricks and mortar and the way we do business generally. So seeing a big shift now to an online environment has definitely changed the way in which businesses are operating, and it's happened really rapidly. So, you know, 2020, 2021, we're really looking forward to seeing how these insights and this statistics are actually going to change. So taking you a little bit through what some of these categories mean, and these are the types of frauds that we're seeing in Australia in the volume and also the value. So lost and stolen card, that is what it is. It's theft from a lost or stolen card. Card never received is where the mail's been intercepted. So looking to deliver a card to an individual and someone's intercepted that mail. Fraudulent application is where someone's taken on the identity of somebody else and actually received a card in somebody else's name and then obviously perform transactions on that. Counterfeit and skimming. So skimming is, you're probably aware of it actually, you know, there's skimming devices at ATMs. It's actually taking the magnetic strip information and loading those to blank card stock, for want of another word, and utilizing those in person. Card not present fraud, so that's the big one here in the list, and where we are seeing the trend towards fraud at the moment, and that incorporates all sorts of things. So it incorporates phone, mail, internet, and also the in-store transactions where instead of actually swiping, dipping, or tapping a card, we're actually inputting the details of the card manually. And then the other category down the bottom is basically everything else that can't be categorized in the larger ones above it. Next slide, please. Okay, so going more into the card not present fraud, and 2020, as I mentioned, was a pretty significant year. We saw a massive increase in retail sales, are up 44% year on year. And as mentioned, this is heavily influenced by COVID and obviously the very, I call it a velocity of shift of retail from bricks and mortar to online. You'll see there in the trends that, from 14 to 17, so 2014 to 2017, there was a significant increase in card not present fraud. And 2017 saw us roll through. I think we got vigilant as merchants. We started to look at solutions and ways to mitigate fraud in the online environment. We had the rollout of 3Ds in its first version. We also had a lot of the global acquirers into the market, and through that market entry, provide some of the fraud tools that they have. We also saw merchants that are transacting with NAB through NAB Transact start to inquire more around fraud mitigation and what the NAB Transact mitigation tools can deliver. Interestingly, we mentioned that big shift to online retail again from 19 to 20, and obviously through that shift, we've seen the increase in fraud. So obviously these individuals are going to play in the areas where the volume is and going to explore, I guess, this velocity of shift to online and see what retailers have done and if they've given thought to robust processes and systems in an online environment, given they needed to shift so quickly. Next slide, please. So going through some of the things that we see as a business, I wanted to cover off some of the merchant scams that are being seen, and wanted to cover firstly what is being seen in the what we call the card present environment, or in the bricks and mortar, and what happens around a terminal, an EFTPOS terminal, for want of another word. So terminal takeover. So basically, in its simplest form, this is when a individual gets hold of your EFTPOS machine and actually uses it to transact on fraudulent card numbers. So how do they do that? They generally operate in more than one person. So you have one individual that distracts the person at the point of sale, and the other individual then would pretend to input a card. And in fact, what they do is they actually decline the transaction. Let's say it's a $100 transaction. They'll add another zero to that to make it $1,000. They will then transact on a fraudulent card that they may have on a phone, on a piece of paper. They've acquired that through means, and actually transact on that card number by manually inputting it into the EFTPOS terminal. The transaction goes through and accepts, and then after the fact, they raise that they've been overcharged for that transaction. So you as a retailer then acknowledges that potentially you made a mistake and have charged $1,000 instead of $100. And therefore you refund the difference of $900 to what they will then present, a legitimate card that they can use to withdraw that money. So, it's a challenging fraud because you need to be vigilant at the point of sale. We need to start treating EFTPOS as it is cash, and making sure that we are aware of the transaction being done, especially in an environment now where a lot more of this has been done, wirelessly. So devices are now Bluetooth and Wi-Fi enabled, so they're much more mobile, as is the payment mechanism now too. So the whole tap and pay and the whole comfort around holding the terminal through the transaction. We're not often seeing what used to be, the terminal stands that devices were hard fixed to. So that's definitely providing the opportunity. Next slide, please. So I wanted to provide a bit more of a detail into terminal takeover, and I've provided a couple of copies of receipts here. So you'll notice the receipt on the left. If we go into the detail of it, you can see there that the transaction type is actually a credit card. It says MasterCard under that, and they've executed the transaction via a signature. They've then refunded the transaction, and you can see that the account type is actually a savings, and it's a debit card. So when we start to look at refunds, we need to really challenge a refund process in an in-store environment, and obviously have some policy around what a refund actually looks like when it's being done in a card present environment. So things like this, there are red flags. So we should always be trying to refund back to the existing card that made the transaction. And we can do things like actually looking at the receipt and going, great, you've used a credit card, it was a MasterCard, and we can confirm that that is the card that is being dipped back in for the refund. So we need to be vigilant in this process and need to be aware, and also challenge the fact that, do we actually need refunds in the store location? And if we do, who has the ability to do that? And should there only be certain people that are trained appropriately? Next slide, please. Terminal theft is rising. And look, as this actually suggests, it is exactly that. It is actually the removal of an EFTPOS terminal from a site. And that terminal is then used for the purpose of refunds onto a card to shift money from your merchant account to their card. So I guess the really concerning thing here, though, is how coordinated this approach is becoming now. And we're seeing this, we're actually seeing groups or gangs of people going into areas and actually taking EFTPOS machines or swapping the EFTPOS machines around. And what I mean by that is obviously multiple banks actually offer the same terminal type. So NABs and Ingenico providing bank, other banks provide Ingenicos as well. So if I take one from one retailer, I can easily swap that with another retailer with the same terminal. And from a retailer's point of view, it just looks like my EFTPOS terminal stopped working. It's still there, so I'm not raising red flags or concerned that anything's happening, other than the fact that the machine's not working. So I've provided a quick video on the next page. If you just go over to that now, Amber. And before Amber presses play, actually she's pressed play, let's just wait there for a moment. It's all right, let it run through. Okay, so what I wanted to draw your attention to here is on the bottom right-hand screen, you'll see the EFTPOS terminals there on the point of sale counter. You'll see two individuals, both in red jumpers, and there's actually a third individual behind them as well. So what strikes me is actually the speed and how coordinated this approach is. I mean, obviously the bodies there in a line like that create a wall for patrons behind them where they can't see what's going on. And then if we run through now, you'll see how quickly the event occurs. So that's an individual I wouldn't play poker with because that sleight of hand is very, very quick. But that's just to draw your attention how quickly that can happen. So that's a challenging environment, right? As far as a retailer is concerned, they've done nothing wrong there. They've been sent to a location for another product, and as their back is turned, that's occurred. So my feedback to that is if you do have problems with your EFTPOS machine where it does stop, and doesn't work, I think we need to pay very quick attention to getting on the phone to our merchant help desks and informing them of the issue so that they can quickly identify what that issue is. And then if this is the case, that it's no longer your terminal, it can be identified quickly. Thanks, Amber. Also wanted to cover a little bit of the common e-commerce fraud and really wanted to highlight kind of the key potential one. Over to one slide, which is bin attacks. And this one actually resonates with me quite strongly because in the last 5 weeks, we've actually had one of our large clients have a bin attack occur on their merchant facility. So to break down a bin attack and what that actually means, a bin attack is where a fraudster uses a pretty sophisticated piece of software. A bin is actually a bank identification number. So that's the first 6 digits on a credit card, and it determines what type of credit card that is. So for NAB, that could be a NAB corporate, it could be a NAB premium, it could be a NAB low cost, a various card type is assigned a bin number. They use the software then to generate many variations of card numbers for the remaining digits and to actually test against expiry dates on those cards. So they will then go to a merchant site, a legitimate merchant site, and use the software to pick up the actual shopping cart environment and hit that shopping cart environment with a number of cards. They generally do that at a $1 transaction. And the reason they use $1 is because they don't want to alert the cardholder that a transaction's gone through. So they use a very low value that you or me might not notice that transaction coming off our card. So to bring it back home and why this resonates with me, so this individual client had this occur on their facility. It occurred over 2 days, and it was hundreds and hundreds of transactions that were hammered into their site. What did that mean for them? Well, most of the transactions were declined, as we would suspect. Any that were positive and actually went through and transacted, they then had to do matched refunds back to those cards, which takes time. NAB actually shut the merchant facility down until remediation work was completed. So we're talking about a legitimate website now with legitimate sales going through that can no longer be done. So they've had to have that site taken down. And then they've implemented mitigation tools, like they are using the fraud scrubbing tool within NAB Transact now, and they've implemented capture as another method to that these bots can no longer use multiple card transactions against. So, and lastly, unfortunately, you are actually charged whether it's a successful transaction, and you are charged if it's a declined transaction as well. So we're now working through with them around a significant merchant transaction volume fee as well, and working through with them with regards to that. Next page, please, Amber. So bin attacks, how do we identify bin attacks? And key here is, as I mentioned, multiple low dollar value transactions. So if you're starting to see multiple low dollar value transactions on your website, that's obviously a sign. Multiple declines is another one. International cards, you'll see most of these frauds occur from international regions. Given it's a website, they don't have to be present. So you'll see a lot of these transactions coming from overseas. Also short period of time. So, if I take this example locally here, those transactions occurred over an hour and a half period, hundreds and hundreds of transactions, which is extremely out of character for this business. Also, where you're seeing repetition of card numbers, the only differences being expiry dates or security codes, multiple transactions on that same card number. And finally, there is around the time of the transactions. Unfortunately, these generally occur outside of business hours. So we're talking early morning, late at night. And that was exactly the example that happened with our customer locally here too. So I'll take you through a little bit now around the fraud prevention. So we talked a little about some of the events that we see. Now I wanted to talk about, what are some of the things we can do to be more vigilant and put some sort of security or prevention in place to stop some of this occurring. So if we go to the next page. And the first one is, I guess, exactly what we're doing here in this forum. It's around education, right? So we're sharing with you some of the insights that we see, and we hope that you do that broadly across the business. We're about to head into some pretty busy periods, especially for bricks and mortar retail. We've come out of some serious lockdowns, and retail is starting to open its doors again. And I think we're going to head into a very busy Christmas period. So, the truth is, where there's chaos, there's opportunity. So we need to be vigilant through this period, and we need to educate our staff. We need to be careful when we're accepting large value transactions, especially when it's card not present. So, the challenge there is, do we really need to be accepting large value card not present transactions? Are there other methods with which we should accept these transactions? Other methods could be an EFT, could be BPay. There are considerations around other methods. Because the truth is, when you put yourself into a card not present environment, you do shift the liability, and it does open you up to potential chargeback risk. Thirdly, never process any third-party payments. So what's a third-party payment? That's where potentially an individual or a business has asked you to transact on their behalf, and they'll pay you plus a margin. So truth is here, what they might do is they might ask you to do the transaction on their behalf, and that happens. And then unfortunately, you're in a position whereby you are now having the charge back against you and your merchant account, and you never provided the goods or services. So unfortunately, you're not going to be able to provide evidence of that transaction ever being completed. And finally there, we talked a lot about the refund process. We need to be more vigilant around refunds. We need to challenge is that actually required in our environment. We need to challenge as well who has the ability to refund, and are they educated enough to understand some of the key concerns when it comes to refunding. We need to treat it like cash. Next page, please. Moving into online and how we prevent fraud in the online environment. We can conduct regular site audits. There are third parties that actually will do security certificate audits on your site, and actually trigger a whole lot of potential breaches and provide reports back to you around where you need to strengthen the security in your online environment. Monitor your site for suspicious activity. We talked about that earlier. We talked about high volume transactions. There's also tools you can use to start tracking shipping addresses and IP addresses, and that's all part of some of the fraud mitigation tools, including the one that we offer through NAB Transact. Set purchase limits. If you're a business that will never accept a payment over $1,500, for example, then potentially should we even have the ability for that payment to go through? Can we limit then, if we ever do have a fraudulent transaction, can we limit the value that we can have that fraudulent transaction made against us? And finally there, I talked about some of the fraud mitigation tools. We've just had the second version release of 3D Secure, which is a fantastic mitigation tool, and in some instances can shift the liability from you as the business back to the issuer. So I wanted to cover that one in a bit more detail, which is on the next slide, Amber. So 3D Secure 2.0. So there was a first release of 3D Secure, and I guess it probably didn't get the cut through that I think merchants were expecting. And the reason for that is it probably added far too much friction at the point of sale. So, you know, there was a process involved for an individual in the shop when they're shopping that they had to go through to identify themselves. And that friction led to cart dropout, which is obviously not good for a retailer, especially in the online environment where they just want their people to get to the shopping cart and make the payment securely and as quickly as possible. So what does 3D Secure do in the 2.0 version? Well, it actually enables the data sharing between the merchant and the issuer. So we think about the merchant here as NAB, and the issuer could be any bank, including NAB. So information that is shared is things like the transaction detail, the payment method, the device information, where the payment's being made from. All of that sort of information can be shared, and then the issuer will make a decision based on their understanding of their client. And obviously we keep information like this, and it can be validated. So if that information matches, it can then be treated as a low risk, and that transaction will go through just as normally. However, it is treated as high risk, then potentially there's not, they need to authenticate themselves further. What does authenticate themselves further mean? It could mean that they enter in their one-time password. It might be a knowledge-based question, or it could be biometrics like a fingerprint just to authorize the payment further. So this is a really good method to ensure that those transactions being done are actually the card holder, and then obviously mitigate any potential for you to have chargebacks in an online environment. This is available through NAB Transact, and it's also available through most third-party gateways as well. So it's not a NAB product. However, it is a very good solution to offer security at the point of sale. Sorry. So what is merchant chargebacks, and what is the process for disputes, and what are your obligations if you have one against you come through your business? So next page, please. So in a very simple form, a chargeback occurs when a cardholder successfully disputes a transaction processed by your business. So what does it actually mean? So potentially you've had a transaction go through your facility. The individual says that they didn't do that transaction. You'd hope they reach out to your business to validate that. If they don't, though, they may go directly to their issuer and dispute the transaction. So it's important to note a cardholder has up to 120 days from the transaction date where they can raise that dispute. So what's actually the process? So if they raise that dispute with their issuer contacts the merchant bank. So let's say the merchant bank in this instance is NAB, and NAB will then reach out to the merchant and will be seeking further validation of that transaction. So further validation could be anything from tax receipts, proof of purchase, proof of delivery is another key one as well. Often we see, you know, that the transaction went through legitimately, but they never received delivery or service or the actual service that was purchased. So all that evidence, and as much as possible as you have to validate that transaction, should be provided to NAB. If for whatever reason you don't provide adequate validation, or you do not respond to the request from NAB, then that disputed amount will be refunded back to the merchant. Back to the cardholder, and you'll also incur a chargeback fee. So a chargeback fee with NAB is $35, and that fee covers the process we have to go through when a chargeback is raised. Next slide, Amber. So I just wanted to cover a few of the common risks, common causes for chargebacks. And important here is obviously that card not present environment, right? So whenever we are key entering a transaction, and that could even be in store because we're taking phone orders, it does open us up to a higher risk and a higher potential for card not present. Generally, when you're in a situation where a card is dipped, swiped, or tapped, the identification has happened at that point of sale that is the individual. So, common causes for chargebacks. Obviously, when NAB doesn't receive the adequate information that we've requested from you, you'll receive a chargeback. The transaction amount may differ from the purchase. There's a potential that the transaction was duplicated. Also, not cancelling a recurring transaction is a very common one. So, if you're signed up to a membership of some sort and you cancel that membership, but that business doesn't cancel the recurring payment, often then that leads to a chargeback. And there's also cardholder disputes that come through as well, whether the product be just defective or not as described. That can also trigger an issue when it comes to NAB for a chargeback. And then obviously the last one there could be the potential that there was fraud. So the card could have been compromised and it was a legitimate fraudulent transaction. Next page, Amber. Okay, so just wanted to highlight the process here because there's some efficiencies we can do around how we communicate with you, the merchant, when a chargeback has occurred. We have to adhere to some pretty strict timeframes when it comes to Visa and MasterCard around when we receive the request for a chargeback and how quickly we have to provide the evidence. So unfortunately, the default method for notifying a merchant of a chargeback is actually via post. And, we talked about the significant trend change to online shopping. So it's no surprise that Australia Post delivery days are blown out by 3 to 5 days. So we need to get this out to you as quickly and efficiently as possible. And we do have an electronic reporting process. So we can actually send these to you via email, but we need you to sign up to it. So there is a link at the bottom and this pack will be shared. But basically that's what we'd encourage you to do. And an action off the back of this, if you aren't already receiving chargebacks via an electronic method, that would be the process we would recommend. Back over to you, Amber.
Thanks, Jared. So we're just going to wrap up now as we've kind of got 2 minutes to close. So important next steps, as Jared said, we'll be issuing this pack after, which has some hyperlinks in terms of some additional useful information and obviously where you can register for the ERS system. So obviously there are other methods of getting in touch with us. So we have our merchant fraud team, our chargebacks team, or actually your direct transactional banking specialist. So both Billy and Anthony have been answering your questions kind of as we've been going through the session today. But by all means, get in touch if you have any additional questions that you do have for us. I'll just get Anthony and Billy to put on their cameras just so you can kind of see who they are, that they've been answering your questions in the background.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you.
Perfect. And that's it. So it's a short, sharp 30 minutes. Hopefully you find that useful. We'll also be doing a short survey at the end of this, just so we understand whether you find this was helpful and what future topics you'd like us to cover off in these sort of 30 minutes client insight series. So thank you for joining us today and hopefully see you for our next session.